So the Moonbase is somewhat of a big serial for the show. The first serial set on the moon, the first defining moment of its incarnation, and the return of the Cybermen. So let's get into the plot and find out how good the return of the Cybermen is. So we begin where we left off, with the TARDIS out of control as the Doctor tries to get them to Mars. Now obviously with the title of the Moonbase, they didn't go to Mars and instead landed on the moon, in the distant future year of 2070. Which out of a lot of the future predictions of classic Doctor Who, that seems like an actually reasonable year for a Moonbase story to be set. So obviously the first thing to address with this serial is that Jamie spends half of it unconscious. Obviously with Jamie's sudden introduction, the scripts had to be rewritten in a hurry, and so Kip Pedler just decided to write him out for a decent chunk. Which is kind of funny, especially in the way the injury happened, with Jamie likely landing on the ground after jumping around the low gravity environment, causing a head injury. Once again written by a scientist. But because of this, Jamie spends a lot of the time not doing anything other than just talking about the Phantom Piper who's going to take him away. Now he does become more prominent in episodes 3 and 4, but spends a lot of that time interacting with Ben, meaning we don't get much of a dynamic between him and the Doctor and Polly. So with Jamie dealt with, onto the titular Moonbase. So the Moonbase is home to a machine called the Gravitron, which is used to control the Earth's weather through gravity. So this is a very interesting scientific idea, and the script does do a few things with it, notably mentioning how farmers and landowners have an agreement with the General Assembly, who are in charge of the Gravitron. Plus we have the way the operators of the Gravitron interact with the official who communicates with them, him being very pompous with himself while not actually doing anything, while the operators are well aware that they will get none of the credit. It does a good job of fleshing out the world, at least to a degree, because the response from Earth to the problems on the base is incredibly minimal. So the Cybermen have planted a plague in the base, which slowly infects the crew and causes problems for them to operate the Gravitron properly. But despite the importance of the Gravitron, which is made clear in the serial on many occasions, the General Assembly doesn't really care about trying to find a solution and just tells the crew to be patient and wait until the next scheduled launch, which given the importance of the Gravitron, this should be of top priority to the Earth. But instead it feels quite minor. The crew at the base are quite well realised. There are only two who are fully prominent, those being Hobson, the commander of the base, and Bennett, his assistant. Hobson begins by being antagonistic towards the quartet when they arrive, but is willing to accept their help. Although as things keep going wrong, he does push against them more and more until the Doctor discovers the cause of the plague. Their claims that the Cybermen are involved does cause most of the doubt due to their extinction, but when he first encounters them, it does shake everything up for him, and he puts a lot more faith in the Doctor. Bennett is a lot more accepting of the quartet, being a far more friendly character towards them, and more willing to take them at face value. But despite this, he does still lose his patience with them on occasion, notably when the Doctor cuts a piece of his trousers for testing, and so he snaps at him in French. Beyond those two, there are several more minor characters who either sit around in the background or have several lines, notably Nils, who feels like the third most important of the base crew, although there are no female crew members, which is definitely the weakest aspect of this quite well-rounded crew who are quite diverse in terms of countries of origin. Ben and Polly now, who are used relatively well, but with a Doctor who is more active, they aren't used as prominently as they were in the previous Cyberman serial. Ben gets a few moments of action, notably when he goes out onto the surface of the moon alone to save Bennett from the Cybermen, but beyond that I don't really recall too much about him. He is of course the one who argues they should leave when Hobson is accusing them of creating the plague. And we get a bit where he and Jamie are moving something in the way of the medical bay door in part 4 and Jamie drops it.
Hey! Behind you! Oh, quick! Ram it!
But that's sort of it, outside of the occasional smart moments due to some shuffling of dialogue. Polly is more notable to me, as she begins by acting as the Doctor's assistant in the medical bay, but by the end has discovered another weakness of the Cybermen. So during her time as the Doctor's assistant, she gets a good jab at him, involving him actually being a doctor, and whether or not he is actually experienced enough to find the cause of the plague, which is very funny.
Polly, are you suggesting that I'm not confident to carry out these tests?
Oh, no. I was just wondering if there was anything that Joseph Lister didn't know in 1888 that might possibly help you now.
But on the other hand, we have the infamous coffee scene in which the Doctor tells her to make some coffee to keep everyone calm. Now this is obviously something I teased back in the 10th Planet as the more overt of the Polly makes coffee scenes because she is a woman. So obviously this one hasn't got the easy out, and something a lot of people bring up to support the sexism of the time, and I can't disagree, but do have to bring up what else she does in the story, which I think helps to balance this. This being the Polly cocktail, a combination of chemicals which can melt the plastic within the Cybermen. So the creation of the Polly cocktail comes from Polly's knowledge of how nail polish remover dissolves the plastic, which leads her to think that a strong enough mix of chemicals would do the same to the Cybermen's plastic parts, with the mix being of acetone, benzene, ether, propane and alcohol. So I could be wrong, but this feels like the first time that the gender of a companion has meant far more than who is screaming, or being the stereotypical hero. Like I could be wrong about this because there is a lot of moments that have gone by in the past 3.5 seasons, but a companion drawing from their knowledge which is connected to their gender is something I don't tend to think about in these earlier years, due to characterisation being a lot more simplistic. Beyond this, Polly doesn't do much more, but I will bring up the moment in which they go to fight the Cybermen with the Polly cocktail, with Ben saying,
But not you, Polly. This is men's work.
Which Polly ignores and joins them anyway. Now, I don't hear people bring up this moment connected with the sexism of the time, which a lot of people would probably bring up and then ignore how Polly ignores Ben and goes with them anyway. I find it interesting how easily Ben gives in to Polly, with him only saying she might get hurt, but can't think of anything beyond that, which does shift his argument towards him worrying about her safety over her being useless in the situation. Polly's insistence on this is great and does go against the coffee argument, as we know she can argue against the sexism she is presented with, although I do think there is a way this scene could have been improved by using the context of the 10th planet. What I mean is in the 10th planet, Ben has to kill a Cyberman to escape during episode 2, an event which has quite an effect on him, and so if Ben was trying to prevent Polly from going for a similar thing, then that would have been a decision of character and not a subversion of the sexism of the time, which while it would lose Polly fighting against the sexism, it would have made a much more interesting moment for the characters. So now we have the Doctor, who is perhaps at his best of the show so far, or at least of this incarnation, with him really getting his first defining moment when he's talking about evil.
There are some corners of the universe which have bred the most terrible things, things which act against everything that we believe in. They must be fought.
But despite this scene and the potential threat of a Cyberman, the Doctor's sillier side is on display, mostly when he's gathering things for testing and steals a guy's shoe. The general playfulness of this Doctor, which makes him seem considerably younger but knows when to act older, is interesting. It really helps to push the idea that this is a younger version of the Doctor, following his renewal. But since he still has the experience of his previous incarnation, he knows when to take things seriously. It really feels like this part of his characterisation has become perfected here. We also get a unique moment of the show, when we get to hear the Doctor's inner monologue in episode 3. Even if the monologue raises more questions, as the Doctor thinks the Cybermen are afraid of gravity, which is why they don't operate the controls themselves, and I don't understand it. Like, it's not a case of they can't operate the controls properly, so use the humans as to avoid the gravitron breaking. Instead, it seems to be a fear of gravity, which seems really stupid. So finally we have the Cybermen, who are used far better than they were in the 10th planet. While their presence is hidden in the opening episode until the cliffhanger reveal, once they're revealed, they're able to be utilised incredibly well. By having the setting of the moon, it really allows them to show off their ability to survive in the unsurvivable to the extreme. Last time it was the cold, but now it's an environment no human could even enter without a spacesuit for protection. But unlike the 10th planet, the environment itself is an important part of the setting, with many occasions where crew have to go outside, which leaves them being at the mercy of the Cybermen. Notably 2 crew members who were killed and their spacesuits left on the ground. Somehow. We also have their redesigns to discuss. Instead of the horrific human behind a mask design, we've got a more mechanical look to them, fully metal helmets and coverings for their hands, which are a part of the rest of the suit. It manages to keep the horror of the original designs without being an evolved version of that design, showing a greater lack of humanity and going further into being machines to survive. But beyond just this, the chest unit have been made much smaller and more compact, and even their weapons being turned into small handguns. Combining this with their new ability to shoot electricity from their hands, and the Cybermen are now far more deadly than they were before, even if there isn't a demonstration of their super strength. Now obviously the original designs were more horrifying, but horrible for the actors to wear in studio, and so that's probably a big reason for the redesign. But even so, this design is still incredible in its own right. I also want to note the interesting use of the Cybermen's ability to survive in environments humans couldn't for how they entered the base, by having made an entrance in the wall which they fill up with sacks when they're not using it. Which while yes, the obvious problem is there's no way a few sacks of something would stop the air from escaping, it is interesting, although the pressure drops are detected by the base crew, but they don't seem to be too bothered about it, despite the fact that it keeps happening. We also have their plague, which I've mentioned several times, which they hid in the sugar, which is why it only affects a few people. But the Doctor seemingly doesn't find this out until he sees a guy dying after he drinks his coffee, which feels very silly because he seemingly tested everything on the base that isn't food or water, which surely would be the first thing or high on the list. But beyond their plague, we also have their mind control devices, which they use to reanimate the crew, which are cool and will be something they go on to use several more times, and it feels like an evolution of their own emotional suppression, plus their massive gun which manages to shoot a small hole in the base, which the crew deal with by putting a plastic tray over it. Then it's useless once the gravitron's active. The serial really makes the Cybermen even scarier, and a much stronger villain than they were before. While the body horror is far less pronounced, the rest of the elements of play are much stronger than before, even if their defeat is being thrown off the moon by the use of the gravitron is a bit underwhelming and quite silly looking. Finally, the behind the scenes of the serial, because apart from the fact that the Cybermen returned within 4 months of their original appearance, the serial saw the production return to Lime Grove Studio D after spending several years in the Riverside studios. This change happened with episode 4, and so there are problems in which you can hear the floor manager or other members of the crew giving instructions, notably this bit.
We are in it already!
This changeover was almost certainly due to the show's drop in viewership, which is unfortunate as the show was beginning to regain its groove under Innes Lloyd and Jerry Davis. But given the use of a base under siege format that took over here, it's fortunate that this storytelling technique did work with the smaller studio. But there is another behind the scenes fact that I want to note as it seems important, and that is the first appearance of an uncredited actor named John Levine, who played one of the Cybermen. Now you're either one of two people, either you know where this story will go, or have no idea why I'm bringing this up and not explaining it. So overall, the Moonbase is a bit of a mixed bag. While it does give the Doctor his first defining moment, which really establishes who this incarnation is and makes the Cybermen an even greater threat than before, by focusing even more on their robotic abilities. But at the same time, the plot is held together by dodgy science, despite being written by the show's scientific advisor. It is a very nice looking story and really established the bus formula, which would become the backbone of this era. But beyond that, there isn't much more to say, other than Jamie got to do literally nothing. But with the quartet back in the TARDIS, they decide to use the time scanner and see what lies ahead of them, with the scanner revealing the foe they're soon to meet. Next time, the Macra Terror.